Thanks for having me here today. Thanks for coming out to this kind of Old West history section. So I wrote an article about Otto Franc and the early years of the Pitchfork Ranch a while back for Annals of Wyoming. And doing all that research, I learned a lot of stuff that I thought was really fascinating. Just to see how these old open range cattle ranches work. Because they operate a lot differently than our ranches do today. So for this talk, we'll go through the life history of Otto Franc, focusing mostly here in Wyoming, and then we'll talk about a few issues of open range cattle, business, and how Otto Franc dealt with that. And hopefully we'll all walk away with this with a better appreciation of a really important figure in the area and sort of the development of the Bighorn Basin. So Otto Friedrich Heinrich Frank von Liechtenstein. I'm not going to say that every time I talk about Otto Frank. We'll just say Otto Frank to keep things casual. Was born in 1846 in Wiesbaden, Germany. Which is a very nice town situated along the Rhine River, a little bit west of Frankfurt. It has this nice Gothic revival cathedral that was built during Frank's childhood. And I've never been to Wiesbaden, but now I'll probably go just to.
We lived there.
Oh, you did? Very cool.
The Air Force.
Is there like Frank family stuff everywhere? I know Frank is probably a common name like Smith in American. So we don't know a lot about Frank's life growing up. As an archivist, I'll admit I'm not super familiar with navigating the sources of other countries, and I don't speak German, so it'd be quite the challenge. But we do know he was from a well-to-do family with resources and connections. He wasn't just a peasant farmer or like a shopkeeper. So he did go to some schooling in Germany. Obviously, he was a very smart guy. We don't know how much schooling he went to, if he did some college or whatever. But in 1866, he leaves and goes to New York City with his older brothers, Charles and Carl, are already settled there. And it's not clear why all these brothers moved to the States when it's apparent their family had a good thing going back in Germany. But, a lot of times in these, I wouldn't say aristocratic families, but in these sort of families, younger sons who aren't inheriting anything are sort of told to bug off. And I'm not saying that Frank was a remittance man, like Richard Ashworth or other characters we have around here, but that might be kind of the situation. So it's clear that these Frank brothers do very well in New York City, of all things, importing bananas. For my research, I found that older brother Carl had been a steward on a ship sailing from New York City to Columbia. And he noticed that the passengers really loved this yellow fruit that they got in Columbia, and everyone sort of thought it was a rare delicacy. And in 1865, he starts this banana importation business with a plantation in Panama. So it was Columbia, and Panama didn't exist yet. Like, it was Columbia, and this fleet of boats moving back and forth between these plantations and New York City. And when Otto Frank shows up on the scene, he's part of the family, this business with his brothers, and they're sort of dominating the early banana importation business into New York City. Go figure. And Otto lived for a while in South America, sort of overseeing the supply side of this business. But the climate really didn't agree with him for whatever reason. So he moves back to New York City and spends another 6 years there, but he's still having health problems. And that's when his doctor suggests that he needs to find a drier climate. And it never says, sources never say explicitly what the health problems are. It's probably pneumonia, because we have a lot of these things in the late 1800s where people with pneumonia are told to go find drier air. So he first came to Wyoming in 1878. he and a group of vacationing hunters step off of the Union Pacific down in Rollins on July 24th. And Frank is 32 years old at the time. And this was Frank's first trip out west, and he kept a journal of this trip. And it's really funny reading this journal because it's clear that these guys just have no idea what they're doing. I mean, obviously, back then everyone has familiarity with horses, but sort of not how to use them in a frontier setting or camping or, just all. I mean, Frank is kind of a city boy at this point. They have trouble with the pack animals who don't want to cooperate. They have this weird accident where they're like viewing this eclipse and then their camp starts on fire. It's not clear how that even happens. So it's all just very sort of bumbling and clumsy, but they eventually get the hang of life on the outdoors. So from Rollins, they spend 2 weeks down in Medicine Bow Mountains, and then they return back to resupply, and they spend the next 6 weeks traveling up into the Bighorn Basin because they're told that the land up there is unspoiled, whatever that is. There aren't white people there yet. And of course, they shoot a bunch of elk and antelope and deer and a few buffalo on their journey. And Otto Frank just loves this. Once he gets the hang of things, he loves being outdoors. He loves hunting. He loves the animals. He just loves the whole frontier experience. And throughout this whole joyride, he kind of has a plan in mind because he's kind of from a business-oriented family. And the word is getting out that open range cattle ranching in Wyoming is a lucrative operation. And, Frank's an astute businessman. He sees a business opportunity and he recognizes that the Bighorn Basin, because there's just no one else really there, no white people really there, was a great place to set up one of these operations. So after his 1878 hunting trip, he returns the next year, this time venturing further north into the Bighorn Basin. And Josh Dean, the frontier mailman, and later the mayor of Meeteetse, in his autobiography recalls meeting Otto Frank camping along Meeteetse Creek, kind of getting the lay of the land. And the Bighorn Basin is just a great place to set up one of these ranches because it's so isolated. You have the Crow Reservation to the north, the Shoshone and Arapaho to the south, the Sioux to the east, and the Sioux don't want white people coming around there. And then you have a bunch of mountains, a bunch of dense mountains to the west. So it's really hard in the early years for people to get in here. So after a summer of looking around, Frank eventually locates in this wide natural pasture on the Upper Grable. There are a few buffalo roaming around. It's a bands of Native Americans who often visit Frank when he sets up here. And he's just upstream from this prominent butte the local Native Americans call Papipo or Boja. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And it's not clear that if that's what his ranch goes by for the first few years, because it's very interesting that Papipo shows up on some very early ranch maps of Wyoming, back when we were in part of Pease County. We were part of Sweetwater. Pease County was the other side of the Bighorn Basin, I think. And you see, there's nothing else in the Bighorn Basin on this map besides Papipo. And Papipo was the first post office in the basin. The federal government records say that it was registered from June 1880 to September 1880. So it wasn't a long-lasting thing, but it was probably at Frank's ranch. And Frank can't formally homestead anything yet in 1879 because it hasn't been surveyed by the General Land Office down in Lander, and it won't be until 1884 when this plat is made. And so he just has a squatter's claim. So he doesn't own anything, which means he's sort of living on government land until the time that he can file a homestead. So you see here, there's Otto Frank's ranch, very primitive road that kind of goes up here and peters off, and there's Forebear Creek and Timber Creek. So with this headquarters, Frank starts building his cattle operation. He trails in 1,200 head of cattle from Oregon, which at that time was sort of the epicenter of Western cattle breeding. And there's really no good evidence how many cattle he has in these early years. I mean, obviously he has over 1,200. But the Fremont County tax rolls from various years in the 1880s say that he has somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 head of cattle. And of course, he adopted the Pitchfork brand, although it's not clear, unfortunately, given recent events, when he started calling his ranch the Pitchfork Ranch. The first mention I found of the Pitchfork brand was from 1883 of the brand book of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. But it doesn't say Pitchfork Ranch. And later brand books in the 1890s will say Pitchfork Ranch, but so it's all very sort of frustrating given if you guys follow the news of you guys know what I'm talking about. I don't need to explain this to you. Otto Franc was certainly a pioneer, but he was not the first cattleman to locate in the Bighorn Basin. Soon he would have plenty of neighbors. So in these early years, Frank is really in the middle of nowhere, but that doesn't mean he's like all alone here. There are still Native Americans calling this place home, even though they're up on the reservation, they still come down here on a regular basis. There are still buffalo in the area, so there are buffalo hunters, and then there are just like trappers and random market hunters who are roaming around, looking for a place to settle, just like Frank did. So in 1879, same year that Frank located on the Graybull, Peter McCullough drove a bunch of cattle from Fort Bridger for Judge William Carter, and located on a tributary of what later became Carter Mountain. Original maps say it was Meeteetse Mountain, which I think is a better name, but no one asked me. John Chapman from Oregon made his headquarters up here on O'Hare Creek. Henry Lovell from Kansas made a ranch headquarters over on the Bighorn, and then John Woodruff, the Embar Ranch down on Owl Creek. And then the first few years of the 1880s, so many other ranches start up. There's Belknap Ranch and the Castle Rock Ranch on the South Fork. There's the Crown and Shield Ranch north of Cody, operated by a weird group of Frenchmen. There's Richard Ashworth and Colonel Pickett, and later A.A. Anderson above Otto Franc on the Graybull. There's Archibald Rogers and Senator Joseph Carey below Otto Franc on the Graybull. There's Harry Cheeseman on Wood River. There's Andrew Wilson on Meeteetse Creek. There's George Baxter's LU Ranch on Grass Creek. And these are just the prominent ones. My point here is that this place ceases to be unsettled like extremely quickly. Within a couple of years, there's a lot of people moving in. So then there's all these primitive ranch headquarters sort of scattered around along rivers, coming out of the Absarokas. It's great ranch land because the wind blows the snow off, hopefully. Yeah. And all these people just let their cattle graze on the open range. It's not like they have fences, they don't fence them in. So with all these other ranches popping up around him, Otto Franc starts building his headquarters. And at first he just lives in a little cottonwood cabin, but soon he builds this much larger adobe house. And for the time and place, this was quite the structure. Most other ranches in the area kind of just had a complex of one-story cabins. You know, with a few exceptions. John Chapman had a big two-story stone house, and A.A. Anderson up on Piney Creek had his big complex up there. But those were built later anyways. They weren't built like in the first couple of years of these ranches. This photo is taken obviously before it was restored. So it has walls 18 inches thick. And I was told that was to protect from Indian attack and stock bullets, which, I mean, maybe. I don't know how much credence I put into that. I mean, because it's not like all these other ranches around are terrified of Indian attack, right? They just have cabins. I think just Otto Franc had a better eye for development. And he had the resources to build a good headquarters and the mind to sort of say, I'm going to be here, we're setting this up. A lot of other ranches just weren't concerned with building like a long-term stable place because they were constantly moving around. They're not dumping a lot of resources into this whole operation. The whole the whole premise of the open range cattle business is you don't have to put a lot of money into anything besides cattle. But clearly Otto Frank thought differently. And you can see this adobe house with a few of the other ranch buildings and wagons. They also built this bunkhouse, which would become with the growing numbers of cowboys and ranch hands that Frank employed. And actually, if you read the sources, most of these cowboys are not living at the ranch. They're out on the annual roundups, and if they're not on a roundup, they're probably not being employed. Why would Otto Frank pay them? Most of the folks living at the ranch are irrigators and a few ranch hands to help with the gardening and fence repairs. I mean, they're mostly like farmers. And of course, he later builds this big, low wooden barn, mainly for the ranch horses and dairy cows. So these photos were taken on the Pitchfork in the 1990s, I think, by the State Historic Preservation Office. There's that barn. You know, they took these pictures when the place wasn't really, I mean, not abandoned, but it wasn't inhabited. There's that bunkhouse in the middle, a few old cabins that are no longer there. And the ranch was initially a business venture with his brothers back in New York City. His brothers helped him sort of get started and move all this money into buying cattle. And in 1884, brother Carl came out to the Wyoming territory to sort of get a look at this operation that they're putting money into. And for whatever reason, these brothers they don't care about what's going on in Wyoming. They don't really care about this ranch. Like I said, they're city kids. They just don't really like hanging out in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. So they are really hands-off regarding the Pitchfork. They really just let, little brother Otto kind of do his thing. And they own it jointly until 1896, when Otto just buys out their shares completely. Now, I wrote that article for Annals of Wyoming about Otto Frank, not because of the old buildings. I was really interested in how open range cattle ranching worked. And Otto Frank kept journals, and the McCracken Research Library at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West has these journals. Has anyone read these? Okay, I'm a nerd, and I haven't read these like in their entirety. Oh, yeah, I know Larry. Right, like Larry, I was telling my wife, there's no more comforting reading than curling up by the fire on a dark winter's night and just reading Otto Frank's journals. It's a really authentic look at sort of what went into running one of these early ranches. From planting his garden every year and observing bird migrations and Wyoming weather and dealing with drunken cowboys who are fighting with each other and, drunken foremen who are getting beat up by other cowboys. And just the logistics of getting supplies into the Bighorn Basin and making cattle shipments. And I really encourage you to read these journals. I mean, I just have a typescript. I think Teaching Museums gave years ago. Yeah, you're shaking your head. So clearly it exists somewhere. I got a copy, so you can get a copy.
And there's a online version from McCracken.
Yes, maybe that's where I got it. I don't remember. It's been a few years ago. So what's clear from these journals is that Otto Frank was really a community leader. His ranch was an important place on the Upper Grable in a way that, for example, Colonel Pickett's ranch just was not. Even though Colonel Pickett was like a state legislator. In 1882, another post office was located at the Pitchfork. They called it Frank. Frank was the postmaster. They initially spelled it with a K. Then in 1883, they changed it just to drop the K to have the C. Same thing with like Frank's Peak and Frank Creek. They always spelled it with a K before, and then they realized they were wrong and they dropped the K. But then soon other post offices would pop up in Meeteetse and Sunshine and Arland. So going back to these journals, it's fascinating to see all the projects and people that Otto Frank is dealing with, and sort of the issues that he had to address, sort of as a local ranching leader. Just to go through a few of these topics in the journal that I think are notable. It's clear he loved fresh eggs, and he spent a lot of time and attention doting on his garden, his cabbages. Because it's not like he can just drive to the store and get a sandwich. I mean, they have to kind of be, they have to be self-sufficient. The nearest supply point for many years is Billings, like a 3-day trip in good weather. So, I mean, it makes sense that he would have to grow a lot of his supplies. On that same point, he regularly shoots elk and antelope for food because they don't want to kill their cattle for food because that's kind of their business. His good friends were the Bradleys, who operated the Ashworth ZBRT Ranch, also socialized with Harry Cheeseman from Wood River, Colonel Pickett, even though they didn't align politically. Colonel Pickett was a Civil War Democrat, and Otto Franc was a Republican, and they actually ran against each other in the state legislature, and Pickett beat Otto Franc pretty handily. John Gleaver, who had a homestead between the ZBRT and Pickett Creek, and John Gleaver was actually the original ranch manager for the Pitchfork Ranch, but then he got beat up by a cowboy, beat him with the butt of a revolver. And Frank says he had to fire him because he, quote, got slapped. I mean, he's probably, the guy's beat up. Why are you kicking him when he's down? John Dyer, the manager of the Belknap Ranch, Pete McCullough on the Carter Ranch, Vic Arlen, George Marquette, James Johnston, who's partner with Richard Ashworth, and then Charlie Kyle, the Hoodoo Ranch manager. And we can go on. But what I love about these journals is that there's such a cool insight to kind of giving a who's who of all these early characters that are moving around the Bighorn Basin and what they're up to. There's not a lot of sources, archival sources that I'm, have access to from that time period. There's a lot of Brody cowboys aren't writing down extensive written records. So not saying, oh, I really don't like that cow, or I don't like Sage Creek. So this is a period of the open range cattle business, and I know we're all kind of familiar with this, but just to explain, ranching on the open range did not involve owning property because it was all just free government land, and ranchers had a small headquarters, usually close to water, and they just grazed all their cattle out on the open range for free. And all these cattle would intermingle in the hills, kind of roam around. So the system didn't really require much animal husbandry or anything like that. These are some early brands from the Bighorn Basin, like I said, George Baxter and LU Ranch, the Tories, Embar, Otto Frank's, the Pitchfork Cattle Company. This is later from the 1890s. And then the Graybull Cattle Company, owned by Archibald Rogers, who was kind of a New York railroad tycoon, who was actually the neighbor of the Roosevelts on the Hudson. But he owned the Graybull Cattle Company, which is was just down here at the confluence of Meeteetse Creek. And you can see that Otto Franc is the manager of that company too, in addition to his own ranch. So he's really getting around and doing things. Ashworth and Johnson, Henry Belknap, George Wise on Meeteetse Creek. And the system makes ranching pretty profitable. These operations are so cheap because ranchers rarely concern themselves with thoroughbred cattle or expensive breeding stock. They just kind of prefer rangy animals who can fend for themselves without much care, without much wintertime feeding. And all these major ranches send their representatives to the roundup, which moved around to different places around the range. They rounded up their stock twice a year, once in the spring to brand and castrate new calves, and again in the fall to gather all the healthy animals and sort of move them, some of the healthy animals, however many they wanted to sell that year, and move them to market. Thomas Osborne worked for Otto Franc for a while. He wrote that Frank had on average 8 cowboys, a horse wrangler, and a roundup cook, and they would start in April or May and be on the range most of the summer, just moving around at different places. And his range extended from the Clark's Fork to Owl Creek, which is a lot of ground to cover. But I mean, you have all summer, and you're probably not getting every single cattle, cattle can hide. And this, again, this system is super cheap, which makes it so profitable compared to more labor intensive and other operations back east where you have to like own property and fence in cattle and feed them constantly. And given the sort of circumstances of the sparsely settled landscape, there's just little incentive to conserve the quality of the range and not just throw as many cattle out there as possible. And as circumstances change and more people settle the area and make their own homesteads, this will be a problem. So in 1883, there's reportedly 100,000 head of cattle just in the Bighorn Basin on the open range, and Frank has about 7,000. And this is sort of seen as the crest of the bubble of the sort of Wyoming open range cattle industry. Because the winter of 1886, 1887 is super nasty. Frank wrote in his journals that the first snows start in September, and by November, there's just snow everywhere, and it stayed. It didn't, blow off or melt away like we usually see it, and it stayed cold. Frank wrote that numerous people died, freezing to death on the open range. The cattle fared worse. Frank also wrote that Indians were coming through and digging out dead cattle out of snowdrifts. Cattle that Frank on the ranch had already butchered, because there's obviously no wildlife around. So they butchered cattle, they just throw them out there, they get covered by snow, and Indians are coming and digging those out to get something to eat. And a good amount of Wyoming cattle ranches are, if not put out of business, they're really destroyed by this. Bighorn Basin was marginally better off than the rest of the state, but not by much. And Otto Frank weathered this bad winter okay, and he wasn't totally destroyed like some other ranchers were. Not just because of luck. I think he also had the foresight to take on a lot of farming endeavors that really strengthened his ranching operation. Frank spent years paying his farmhands to level all the land in the fields west of the Butte, and he built canals off of Frank's Fork and smaller ones off Timber Creek and Papapo Creek, and another larger one on the north side of the river. They called it the Newell Ditch. And making these ditches occupied most of his time, according to the journals. I mean, he's not out there. He'll visit some of these roundups every now and again, but he's mostly concerned about farming. And they did all this, obviously, to grow crops. Hay for winter feed, timothy, alfalfa, wheats, and oats. These are the crops that he mentions all the time in his journal. And all of this farming work means that he's just much more capable of handling adverse weather conditions, whatever Wyoming throws his way. Drought, winter storms. He's just much more easier. He can handle this more than other operations in the area. Because like the Mormon settlers in the middle of the basin, they're irrigating, but they identify as farmers. Many of these cattle ranches in the area, especially those with absentee owners, which frankly is most of them, they're just not farming because it's too much work and too much investment. And again, I want to stress that the whole open range cattle business is predicated on very little investment of time and manpower. You kind of just have a cabin and you pay some cowboys to move around every summer. That's really it. But Otto Frank actually lives here, and he sees sort of what needs to be done to maintain a successful operation. And I think it's really interesting because Frank is employing far more farmers and irrigators than cowboys. And it's just notable that the most successful cattle ranching operation in the area is kind of more of a farm. It's kind of just more of a big farm. So here's Otto Frank at the train station. It's probably up in Billings, but who knows for sure. So in the early years, after the roundup, cowboys would cut out a portion of the herd and move them up to Billings, where Frank shipped them out to market in Chicago or Omaha. The nearest shipping points were Billings, or he could go down to Rollins, and those are his nearest choices, and he chooses Billings. And Frank realizes this sort of situation isn't ideal because his cattle are going to market having traveled across the hot, dry Bighorn Basin. And it'd be better to get them to market in prime condition. So he makes a deal with Chief Plentycoo on the Crow Reservation to graze the animals up there. And then when they're ready and they're nice and fat, they move them over to Billings, just right next door, and they weigh them out there when they're really fat. And this is just a much better deal. They take the cattle up there in the spring, they let them lounge around and eat all summer. They graze them on Beauvais Creek, which is named for my fur trapping relative with Manuel Lisa. And then they put them on the train in Billings, and they're fat. This is obviously a good decision, and Frank's a really good businessman, and I'm really impressed with his sprawling operation. He has the Pitchfork Ranch and all the cattle and irrigating and farming going on there. He's managing the Bar TL Ranch down the river, Archibald Rogers Ranch. He has this other grazing operation up in Montana on Beauvais Creek, and he would regularly go east to buy cattle and visit family in New York. In later years, he loved ocean fishing on Catalina Island down by Los Angeles. So the guy gets around. I mean, he's living on an isolated place, but he might travel more than I do. And as one of the most notable members of the early Bighorn Basin community, he really takes a leading role in developing the area. He served as the Justice of the Peace, and he held trials at the Pitchfork. And he was really adamant in dealing with Billings businessmen and getting them to improve access to northern Wyoming so folks down here could do business up there. This is a letter that Frank wrote to the Billings Board of Trade, which is kind of the Chamber of Commerce, in 1883, convincing them to build a bridge at Corbett Stage Stop over the Stinking Water so that ranchers and farmers could get up to Billings to sell their products and do business. I don't know why that line's there. This is the first bridge over the Stinking Water. You can see it right over there. This is Corbett's stage stop. So the modern highway runs right through here. And this allowed folks to get across the river any time of year. Obviously, it was super dangerous in the spring and the winter to ford a river with a wagon. And again, this is built largely thanks to Frank's initiative and good communication skills. So let's get into some thornier issues with cattle rustling and sheep deadlines. So as a local leader and the competent person on the Upper Graybull, Frank couldn't help getting drawn into politics. And this was seriously strained in 1892 during the Johnson County War. And we don't have time to go into all the causes of the Johnson County War, but you've hopefully read something about that. Let it suffice to say that it's kind of caused by small homesteaders and farmers moving into Wyoming, and all of these entrenched cattlemen who already have existing operations kind of grow to resent the presence of these new people, and they sort of blame them for the losses on their herds. Whether that was accurate or not, we can stand here and debate all day, and people have done that. So that's kind of what the issue is. So the most notorious events of the Johnson County War take place over by Buffalo, but the Bighorn Basin is not immune from this. Frank mentions some rustling incidents in his journals, and also that local ranchers are having meetings to discuss sort of how to coordinate to eliminate all this activity. And as his newspaper clipping makes clear, these ranches are arming their employees as this tension escalates, and they're also employing range detectives to sort of confront these rustlers. So in April of 1892, a bunch of gunmen hired by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, invaded Johnson County and has that shootout at the KC Ranch that we all know about. In June of 1892, hired gunmen killed Jack Bliss, a horse thief, up at the head of the South Fork. Otto Franc charges Butch Cassidy with stealing horses and at the bar TL with the bar TL brand, and he stood as a witness at that trial down in Lander. Of course, it always says, I don't get these like weird 1890s jokes that are in these newspapers. They're just not very funny anymore. Name of the banana belt, like whatever. And of course, people have made a lot of hay over the years of claiming that Otto Franc was sort of responsible for pushing Cassidy on a life of crime, which I think might be a tad of an embellishment, but he was certainly involved. In October of 1892, some range detectives employed by Frank and other cattle ranchers in the Bighorn Basin were entangled with the murder of Jack Bedford and Dab Birch. They were kind of just small time ranchers. And there are many conflicting stories about how this went down. It's kind of every participant had a different view. I mean, we don't know Birch and Bedford's view because they died, but a lot of different versions of this, and we're going to talk about the simplified one. Birch and Bedford had been accused of stealing horses over on the No Wood River, but they were acquitted at their trial, which obviously made these ranch detectives pretty angry. After the trial, Bedford and Birch got into a physical altercation with some of these range detectives. H.P. Pepperly, John Wickham, Joe Rogers, and these guys were employed by Frank and some of these other larger ranchers. And with this public fight, they were charged with disturbing the peace, and they were successfully convicted on that charge. And probably the other charge too, that they couldn't just be nailed down with, but you know how it works. It's like getting the mob boss from Chicago on tax evasion. You know, you got to get them on something.
Yeah.
As the prisoners they have to be transported all the way over to Buffalo because that's the county seat. So their hands and feet are tied around their horses, and their sort of handlers take them out and on the trip over the Bighorn Mountains. And I think this whole trial takes place in Otto, back when Otto was like the leading community in the Bighorn Basin. And as they're at the crossing of the Bighorn River, they are confronted by Heverly, Wickham, and Rogers, these range detectives who, they bear a grudge. So these range detectives drive off the handlers who apparently the handlers might have been in on it. Like, we don't really know. They drive off the handlers and they basically just assassinate Birch and Bedford in cold blood. And during these events, Frank had been up on the Crow Reservation preparing for a shipment of cattle because it's fall. And when news reaches Frank about what had happened, he falls into paranoia because he knows that people aren't going to like this and they're going to know he has something to do with it. And local folks in the Bighorn Basin were super angry that Birch and Bedford had been murdered and no arrests were made. About a month after the killings, the three range detectives were finally charged with murder, but by that time they had escaped up to Montana with Otto Franc's help. And his journal entries, it makes clear that he gets word whenever there's a posse in the neighborhood that are looking for these guys, and he's able to move them away to escape justice. The men are eventually arrested up in Montana, but when Wyoming tried to have them extradited back here, the state of Montana refuses to give them up because the state knows that as soon as they go back to Wyoming, they will be lynched basically by local mobs. And they're probably right about this. And this kind of leads to a legal standoff between the state of Montana and Wyoming. That's another whole other story. But it's clear that local sentiment is just not on the side of these cattle ranchers. And whatever they were doing to deal with this rustler activity, ethical or not, probably kind of verging on some bad stuff. And all this was really detrimental to Otto Franc's respected position in the community, and people kind of start to resent him. George Renner recalled that a petition was signed by local men offering $1,000 for Frank's left ear. So, I mean, he probably did have some reason to fear for his safety. So there's hostilities regarding rustlers. There are also some resentments regarding sheep. Throughout the 1890s, there's more and more sheep coming onto the range, and what had initially been the domain of these powerful cattle ranchers is becoming overrun by woolies. And of course, the ranchers resent the grazing of the rangeland that they assumed was their preemptive right because they were here first and they have historical precedence, and because they just feel that the cattle are entitled to the grass. And I should say at this point, there's no laws regarding grazing on the public domain, which the ranchers liked as long as it was benefiting their operation. They just didn't like it when other people started to benefit too. In March of 1897, Otto Franc mentions in his journal that he and Dad Pierce, the owner of the 91 Ranch up on Rawhide Creek, and later the supervisor of the Show National Forest, they rode around to all the sheep outfits to discuss the creation of separate zones for cattle and sheep, which they did. And they created a deadline, separated sheep and cattle. And I can't remember where exactly that deadline was, but basically the mountains were cattle country, and the further you moved into the basin was sheep country. And Otto Franc didn't really get involved with open conflict with sheepmen, as kind of happened over in the Spring Creek raid. The whole set of circumstances was really indicative of the fact that there's probably people in the neighborhood who are really starting to resent Otto Franc, people like him. And his position as this sort of authoritative cattle baron who thought he sort of owned the whole area because he was here first was maybe not a good stance to have anymore. Which leads us to Franc's death and the end of our story. So on November 30th, 1903, Franc was out walking along the river just east of his ranch house. He carried an exposed hammer double-barreled shotgun in case he happened across any rabbits or ducks or coyotes. A short while later, the guys back at the ranch heard one shot. They didn't really think that much of this because, they probably thought he got a rabbit or something. They didn't really care until he didn't come home. And a small search party sent out shortly afterwards found Franc's body about a few hundred yards east of the ranch house. And he was lying face up about 3 feet from a barbed wire fence with his 10-gauge shotgun propped up on the fence nearby. And there was no evidence of a struggle. The right barrel was empty as the shell had been fired, and the left was loaded with the hammer still cocked. The Cody Enterprise reported, quote, "The gun had been charged with buckshot, and the discharge tore through the heart, doubtless causing instant death. From the surrounding circumstances, it was evident that the hammer of his gun cocked and went off and killed the deceased instantly." So Franc's death kind of shocked his neighbors, and newspapers reported it far and wide, right? He's getting newspaper articles in Salt Lake City and Chicago and Cheyenne, probably others in Omaha that I have found, probably other places, maybe Kansas City. Now, investigators theorize that after having crossed the fence himself, Franc began pulling the gun towards him through the wire when it discharged and sort of just blasted into his chest right above his heart. So it was that one newspaper reported that, quote, "The man who faced 1,000 dangers of frontier life without harm met his death in this unfortunate manner," which kind of is ironic. So speculation at the time questioned the initial conclusion that Otto Franc's death was a mishap. Some doubted that Frank would have been so foolish to carry around a loaded shotgun with exposed hammers primed, much less pull that same gun, that cocked gun, through a fence. Some news accounts, perhaps due to the improbable nature of the tragedy, stated explicitly that Frank was known as a careful man with firearms. And let me just editorialize, if you read the newspapers around here today, it's not like people who are well versed in firearm safety don't have accidents, right? I read the newspaper probably more closely than a lot of people do, and there have been plenty of tragic accidents that happen with people who have been around guns their entire lives. So it's not like that's impossible. It totally could have happened. Other people immediately pointed out that all the enemies that Frank had made in his dealings with rustlers and sheepmen, and suspecting that some sort of element of foul play in, the sudden removal, the easy removal of one of the most prominent cattle barons of the area. And when the publishers of the Red Lodge Picket heard that Frank was dead, they immediately suspected some sort of criminal connection. And as they explained, they sort of thought that, this guy was involved kind of violently with all this rustler activity a while back. So it would kind of make sense that people had it out for him. If Frank's death was an accident, many people had a hard time grasping just the sheer carelessness of the incident. But the coroner's jury had been assembled, and with guidance of local lawyer William Simpson, they went over the ground and they inspected all the physical evidence, and they heard testimony of witnesses, which I guess, who were the witnesses? The ranch hands. And Dr. Bennett here from Meeteetse testified that the wound was as large as a silver dollar and just severed the aorta of the heart instantly. And the muzzle of the gun could have only been about a foot away from his chest when it went off. And given all the evidence, despite the initial murmurs, the verdict was clear that Frank had been died literally of like a heart-rending accident. So Frank was 57. He was buried in Meeteetse Cemetery. Frank's two brothers from New York City were the only relatives at the funeral. Frank's will stipulated that the balance of his estate be split between his sisters, who were still living back in Germany. Apparently his brothers probably had enough money with the whole banana thing. And when Charles and Carl went into the process of probating their brother's will, they found that he owned over 1,900 acres of private land and over 2,000 head of cattle. And this, wasn't that much from what he trailed in the basin in the first place in 1879, but the cattle business had changed a lot between now and then. The entire spread of his spread on the Upper Graybull was purchased by Lewis Phelps, and the Phelps had already bought the ZBRT Ranch from Richard Ashworth, and in 1904 they bought the Four Bear Ranch from Colonel Pickett, who moved back to Kentucky in his old age. Who knows? Maybe Otto Franc had died, and he was like, "Oh, it's time to get out of here." At this point, Phelps established a handful of ranching corporations: the Phelps Land and Cattle Company, the Graybull Cattle Company, the Rocky Mountain Cattle Company, with a revolving door of large Bighorn Basin ranchers and landowners as his business partners. And so it was that these old cattle barons who first created this open range cattle industry were being eclipsed by corporate ranching enterprises who sort of consolidated big tracts of private rangeland. And Otto Franc's death really sort of marked the end of an era. He started ranching here when Indians and buffalo were still around, and sort of witnessing firsthand the country fill up with people and cattle and ranchers, flocks of sheep. And he sort of lived to observe the open range transform into a civilized landscape tamed by irrigation and barbed wire and corporate conglomerates. So 5 miles upriver from the Pitchfork Ranch, it's a large tributary, Frank's Creek, Frank's Peak. You can see here in this map, 1897, they're still spelled with a K. They always did that. There's always errors in these old maps. All the way back in 1884, Otto Franc and his friend Thomas Osborne had climbed up this peak to look around back when white people were still in the process of exploring the landscape. And people still climb up there every year, from which they can see the entire Graybull Valley and all of this land that Otto Franc witnessed firsthand develop from a frontier just into another extension of the modern society. So that's Otto Franc, and that's the Pitchfork Ranch. Thanks for hanging in there with me, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
That one of your clippings just a couple of slides ago referred to his library, his
Yes.
books. Do those books still exist together as a unit?
I mean, I don't think so. I haven't checked at the TT library. I should ask the librarian, but I kind of doubt it. You know, books don't last that long.
Yeah. Interesting.
Anything else? Yes.
What was the process of him actually becoming the owner of that land?
So once the land was surveyed by the general land office down in Lander, he could file a homestead claim for 160 acres, which he did. And then he owned that outright. And then a lot of as the process usually went, some of his cowboys and employees probably homesteaded land around him, and then he bought it from them. What happens in a lot of these ranches is the owner homesteads their little parcel, and then they get all their employees to sort of homestead around them, and they just buy it out instantly. Yeah. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So it's a slow process of accumulating private land from the open range. And after, I mean, years later, so the Homestead Act of, 1861, only lets you get 160 acres. And as time goes on, the US government realizes that a lot of land in the West, can't be homesteaded and improved by those standards, because you have to be able to improve it. There's a lot like up on top of a mountain, or in a lot of these like really dry hills, you can't homestead that. So they make other homestead acts like the Timber Homestead Act and the Grazing Homestead Act, which can give you up to 620 acres. Those come about in the teens and 20s and 30s. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact dates. And that's when you get these larger homestead tracts. Does that make any sense? But in the early years, all these creeks get settled and homesteaded really fast. So then all the cattle on the open range lose access to that water because they're being settled up. Obviously, if you file a homestead, you're going to do it on a creek. You're not just going to have some rocky, barren, dusty knoll. And that obviously disturbs the open range cattle industry, because these cattlemen have to allow their cattle to get access to water somewhere. And all the springs are being homesteaded. People are obviously going to go where is a good place to set up. If that makes any sense. Anything else? Yes.
The other idea of why that transition from open range to private property and government owned property. So much of the Pittsburgh is state land, rather than just normal school section.
I have no idea. I've asked that too. And I mean, there's got to be a way to look that up in some tortuous maze of documents down at like the state archives. I don't know. Yeah, it goes beyond the typical school state sections of the township and range, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I don't know. Could have been some sort of trade with the state. I don't know. That's a question I'll look up or try to. Yeah.
Yeah, in these journals of his, did he ever write in German?
I don't think so. I haven't looked at the original journals that are like written in by hand because I want to save my eyes. And I just read the typescript because some poor, probably an intern back in the 70s went through and did all that typing. I'm clearly going to read the typescript. I don't think he wrote in German. I don't think so. Yes.
Do you know why he didn't marry? Why he wasn't married?
That's a great question. I hadn't thought about that.
Careful.
He could have married back in New York City. I think he was just more concerned with business. And then once he got out here to Wyoming, who's he gonna marry? There's no one around. Especially not, Otto Frank is like a competent person who's kind of at the head of the community. It would be really hard to find a match for Otto Frank. I don't know. But that being said, other ranchers in the area, if they want a wife, they engage with they write letters to a matrimonial service back east, and they get some woman to come out with them to their ranch. And as like a well-off person, you wouldn't think that he would have a hard time doing that. I just think from reading his journals, Otto Frank was just so concerned with the operation of this ranch. He wasn't actively on the dates. That's my speculation. I don't really know. Great question. But I mean, a lot of these, there's other examples of these early people out here who don't marry. Maybe they're not interested, or
The local
I have no-
city had a lady friend.
there you go. And everything that the locals say, I know. Not a capacity behind it. Yeah.
Does the name or the pronunciation Franc never come up?
Well,
That's
I'm
German.
I speak German.
Yes.
Otto Franc. And it's Wiesbaden. No, it's
Oh, okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'll leave now then. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
B spots.